good morning to all of you, or afternoon, or whatever time zone you're in. My name is Dick Krueger, and as you know, I'm with the University of Minnesota. I've had the good fortune of doing focus groups for a number of years. I've learned a few things about it, and I'm still learning about how to do them better. And what I'd like to do today is share with you some of the things that I've learned over my years of experience with focus groups, and particularly with online focus groups. And one of the things that I want to begin with is that I'm going to be sharing with you today some of the things that have worked for me and for colleagues that I've worked with. This is sort of an ongoing process where over time, as situations change, we find some things work better and some things begin to work less well. And so the advice I give may or may not fit each of the circumstances that you will be facing as you do. So think about these as sort of just suggestions, not as gospel, as the absolute truth. That these are ideas that you may want to think about. And building on that, I know that some of you have conducted a number of focus group studies yourself with differing groups of people. And once you've done them, a couple things become obvious. There are certain things that work well repeatedly, and there are some things that don't work well, and that you learn from those. And what I'd like to suggest is that those of you who have done a number of focus groups, you've learned some things, and I'd like to hear what you've learned. That what have you done that repeatedly works well? What have you done that didn't work well, and how did you fix it? What did you do to correct that situation? I'd like you to write to me and tell me. When the session is over, I'm going to send a note out to many of you and asking for an invitation for your tips. So as you're thinking about these today, think about your own experiences and what's worked for you and what's not worked for you. Also, as we go along, I'm going to be reserving the last half hour for a Q&A session. And in the meantime, if you have a question that comes to mind, put it in the chat area, write it down. We may not be able, because of the numbers of people that are involved today, we may not be able to get to every question. I suspect that we're not, but I will look over those chats, and if there's, I'll put together some of the similar kinds of questions and try to provide answers and send them back to you. And so think about as you're going through if there's something you'd like to know about. I'm going to also make available my slide set to you, not today, but very soon. This will be available, and you'll be able, so today you can just sort of enjoy or take a few notes if you wish, but I'm going to be covering a number of topics. And I'm going to switch now to my slides and go through these, and we'll be kind of moving at a fast pace. And so let's let me go now to my sharing screen, and let's take a look at what these slides might be. So be patient with me as I do this. Okay, and so here we are. All right. These are the topics we're going to cover, and we're going to cover a number of them very quickly. We're going to talk about some essential elements, the planning of the Zoom focus group, developing questions, recruiting and inviting, how you introduce and provide ground rules for the group, how you actively involve participants, capturing of the data, including taking notes, some special issues that come up with Zoom and other online kinds of platforms, and a quality control checklist. So that's our agenda. Let's jump into it. First, I wanted to review what I call the essential elements of focus group research. This is sometimes lost when people start talking about focus groups, because particularly when you start looking at a number of what's called focus groups in the media and market research. They are some kind of a group conversation, but I would not call them focus groups. The essential elements, I base that on the early writings of Robert Merton and his colleagues as they talked about what a focus group is and why it works the way it does. And to me, there are these 5 characteristics that are important: that it's a small group, a limited group in size. And in a normal focus group, we recommend often 6 to 8 people. In market research, it's slightly larger. They may often go to 10 to 12 to 13 or 14. But in the academic nonprofit, we go with usually smaller groups. People are invited. This is not a you all come. It's not an open meeting. It's not like anyone who wants to. People are invited because they have certain characteristics in common. It's a homogeneous sample by invitation. The conversation is focused. That's why the name focus group. The conversation often begins broadly and then narrows to a more specific topic. And so it follows a pattern, and that the questions are developed in advance. They're carefully thought through, and there's a focus to this process. The environment is permissive and non-threatening. This is one of the problems with those that are done on television or media. Oftentimes you lose this permissive, non-threatening. And we find that people tend to talk differently when they're in a threatening kind of an environment, or when, for example, if their supervisor is present, the conversation may change. Or if they feel that it's going to be known to everyone in the community, the topic or the way they talk may change. And the purpose is to help understand the topic of interest. So these 5 characteristics are true of online focus groups as well as in-person focus groups. In planning the focus group, and here I'm going to be referring mostly to Zoom because this is sort of the dominant platform that most people use. However, there's several others out there. What we have found to be most workable are to have small groups, 4 to 6 people. You might call this the sweet spot. Below 4, you don't have quite the diversity and the differing views. When you get over 6, it often results in people truncating their comments and not explaining things in enough detail. 4 or 5 works very well. There's fewer questions. A normal focus group might have 10, 12, 14 questions. In these groups, we typically have 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8, depending on the nature of the questions. It's a shorter time frame, less than 90 minutes, often 60 to 75. It can vary depending on the topic, but it moves along. It isn't one of those long, lengthy 2-hour plus kinds of sessions. One of the things we also do in the planning stages is we do a little technical check with the participants about what have they used Zoom before? Have they used something else? What is the best time of day and time to do these, so that when we set them up, we can do them in a way that's comfortable to participants. One of the things, and in the planning stage, that we highly recommend is you do a test run with your friends and colleagues, not necessarily participants, but you can test some of the questions, but get familiar with the options and the protocol. You want things to run smoothly once you get going. The test runs really help you. And be aware of the features that Zoom has, such as recording, the sharing screen, the polling. We don't necessarily use all of those. We try to keep it simple, but get familiar with these as you set it up. One of the big challenges is developing the questions. This, on the surface, it might seem simple, but this one is critically important to the success of your study. This is where several heads are really helpful in developing what are your key questions, your most important questions. And these questions are sequenced. You know, there's an opening question, typically a transition, one or more key questions, and often an ending question. We begin often in our planning as we think about questions of zeroing in, narrowing down, what are these key questions, the ones that drive the study, the ones that are the most important for you to know. And then we build the other questions around those key questions. We number the questions. How this sounds, I'm surprised how many people are doing focus groups in person in Zoom without numbering the questions. The reason we number of them is for everyone else who's working with these, for researchers, people looking at transcripts later. We know where we are in the process. Without numbering, these can get rather confusing. And so they're primarily for use by the moderator and the research team, but number your questions. The questions are written out in a conversational language. Be careful of jargon, specialized words, but keep your sentences short and clear. And one of the things, I'll come back to this and talk about it in a bit, and this is quite important in online groups, is have active engagement of participants. They do something in the group, not just looking at the screen, not just saying a few words, but you're getting them to do things. They're sorting, they're rating, they're listing, they're choosing, and then they discuss. But this active engagement and involvement is very helpful to the success of your group. And in these online groups, we often go a little more frequently, not every question, but several of the questions will use a round robin style where we have each person sort of giving a chance to answer the questions. In these online groups, one of the challenges, and I'll get to this later, is controlling the amount of time that people speak. Some people will choose to speak at great length. And in person, if you're in a group, you can control that a bit by your eye contact, by signals. When they're online, it is more difficult to do that. And so round robin questions can be one of those ways of being sure that the less talkative people are engaged and that the more talkative ones know that they have to pause and wait for the other people to answer. And then the final question is often one of offering final advice or asking what's most important or something we must remember, but it's a question that asks them to kind of pull together their thoughts and to give sort of their concluding statement in the group. And by the way, one of the interesting reasons we do this is that we find in focus group, as contrary to most other research methods, in focus groups, people have been known to change their mind. That's an interesting quality. Rarely happens in individual interviews. In surveys, I've not seen it occurring, but I have seen it in focus groups. And the reason makes a lot of sense, is that as people talk and discuss topics, they listen to each other, and sometimes people offer convincing statements, arguments for a point of view. And we see people modifying and changing how they think about it. Sometimes that can be the most important thing you find in a study, is where people are modifying or changing. And so sometimes we'll ask that question of, have there been areas here where you've changed your mind on certain topics? But keep in mind, that's one of the unique potentials that a focus group offers that other means of inquiry don't. Recruiting and inviting participants. As I'd indicated, it's a homogeneous sample. That means that there is something that is binding them together. They have something in common. They have participated, they have done something, they live in a neighborhood that is close to other people, they have a demographic that is similar to others. It could be, part of it goes back to what you're trying to find out and from whom. This is not where we deliberately have a diverse group. We're looking for people who have done something. I mean, they may be diverse in terms of ethnicity, they may be diverse in terms of geography, but they do have something in common, and that's the key part of what you're looking for. Also, they're what we call information rich. They've done something, experienced something, they know something, and they've done it enough times where they are rich. They have insights about how something works. The invitation is personalized. But when you invite, it's quite important for people to feel that they're invited uniquely. You're not just a random sample of a bunch of people in the neighborhood. We invited you because you have lived in this community. You have done certain things, and you have knowledge about how things work. And so we'd like to have you participate. The invitation is repetitive, which means that you contact them usually in person or by telephone. It could be that if you use the media, you do it in a way that's personalized. And you also at that time let them know the benefits, the value of their being involved. One of the questions that sometimes comes up is incentives. Up to this point, in most of our experiences with online focus groups, we have only occasionally used a financial incentive. The primary incentive has usually been intrinsic. These are often people who are committed to a topic. They might be employees, they might be staff, and they are often willing to give us an hour or an hour and a half of time to talk with the topic. But there are times where you may need to have a financial incentive. Just as an aside, I did just a quick look this morning on Craigslist under the topic of gigs, G-I-G-S, and a number of market research firms are inviting people or recruiting people to be in focus groups. And oftentimes the key incentives is financial. Anywhere from $75 to $150 is not at all unusual for people to be in a 1.5 hour online focus group. And so that, in some ways that's your competition, but don't assume immediately that you need the financial. Think in terms of the allegiances, the loyalty, the benefit to the community. You may need to articulate that, why this study is going to be helpful to you or people like you in the community, and how it's going to make things better. And we have found that many people will do it because it's sort of part of being helpful, a good citizen, and willing to commit to something they believe in. Also in the beginning, you may want to just check with them to find out if they have had experience. Many people we find have been a participant in a family, a Zoom session, or some other topic, and to know what works for them, what experience have they had. If they're completely new, you may have to do a little practice session with them or have some background information you send them. But in our experience, many of the people we've found have had already some experience and some basic knowledge of what it is. When you first begin your session, there is this part that we call the introduction. It's short, snappy, to the point, 3 to 4 minutes long, where you're introducing it and you're providing them with some ground rules. Here are some things you'll want to cover. You'll want to introduce yourself. Who are you? And how are you connected to the topic? Tell them who the sponsor is, what the purpose is, and how the results will be used. Um, this knowledge about, and this is sort of unique to the nonprofit, academic, public environment. In market research, they're very cautious about not telling you a lot about this. They often do not identify the sponsor. This is proprietary information that they will not share. But we find in the public health or in the public sector, the topics can be sensitive and people want to know who's asking for it? What are you going to do with it? How will they be used? And they also often want to know, how were they invited? Why were they invited? Why, how did you get my name? And so be ready to give an answer. And also what we find is many people want to know, can I get a copy of the results? This is something you should think about ahead of time. If at all possible, I recommend that you offer a copy, perhaps of your executive summary, or if they want, of the larger report. We never share copies of the transcript. We don't share copies of the audio recording. These are only available to researchers. And the copy that they have, there would be no names attached. There may be statements by participants, but they're not identified by name. And then we indicate also no names are used in the final report. And then there's some guidelines, have your camera on, we're recording, and so we don't want to miss anything. And then have them practice several tasks. And there's several that, now today, if this were a smaller group, I would ask you all to do this. But our group is so large, we can't fit onto one screen. But one of the things that I found helpful is a couple simple kinds of things that I share, and then we practice it in these first few minutes. Like one of them, I ask them to think about where the camera is, okay, and then wave to the camera, and that this is something that we will do if you want to speak. There are times where you can just jump in, and that's okay. There are times where I'll call on you, but there are times where you want to share something. And when that happens, put your hand up and wave it, and I'll try to spot those and call on you to give you a chance to do it. Another tactic that has worked well for me, and you may want to think about if would it work for you, is to use the heads. And we all practice, let's nod our heads. Like nod your head as if you were agreeing with something. And if you disagree with something, how do you move your head? Usually side to side. And we might practice those things. Nod your head side to side. And if you hear things that other people are saying, you might want to use those kind of signals, and others can see those, and that can give us some clue as to how people feel about it. And think about whether that would work for you. Another thing that we might do is, if you have a little a card of some kind that you write on a word and you hold it up to the camera. It might be a one-word answer. For example, how many, if you're doing them with mothers or parents, how many children do you have? And write the number down, hold it up, and we quickly can see the screen. And if you're taking notes on that, you want someone quickly, one of your colleagues perhaps, quickly write down those numbers. They hold them up long enough where you actually get those numbers down. You can't do it for complicated things, but briefly, hold up the piece of paper. Another one that works well, and I want to come back to this in just a minute and talk more, is rating things. There are times where you may want to give people a choice. where we use fingers to rate things, a 5-point scale, or we use thumbs up or thumbs down. I'll come back and talk to those in a minute. But and by the way, you wouldn't review these unless you were actually going to use them in your focus group. But these are things that help get people active and feel like they're participating in the study. But then what finally you do is at the end of your introduction, you begin with the opening question. And the opening question is typically a round robin. Each person answers it. And you usually, it often is nice if it's connected in some way to the topic. For example, one that we've used, and we've used it when we know we have parents in the group. Tell us one thing your child does that makes you smile. We go around the room and we talk about it. Okay, I'm a big advocate of actively involving participants. And in order to do that, you need to do some practicing. I mentioned some of those earlier, and I want now to go into a bit more detail. The waving, nodding, and jotting notes down are pretty obvious. They work. You can also use the chat room of having people put things into the chat room. And that you'll get familiar with some of the features that are on the available on Zoom. When I've led groups, I find it difficult to look at the chat room and still carry on with the conversation. And that's also going to be true today, as I won't be able, if you're making notes in the chat, I have a hard time doing both of those things at the same time. And so I usually prefer having them doing things that others can see right there in the group. One of those that I'd like to just try is, well, let me give you a couple interesting questions, and I'm not going to have you do it because most of you are off screen right now or have your screens off. But think about this, that one of those is to use what we call the thumbs up or the thumbs down. And I like to do it in terms of like a 5-point rating scale, that if you agree, you put your thumb up. If you disagree, you put your thumb down. If you're neutral, you put it in the middle. Now, if you strongly agree or feel strongly in favor, you put your thumb up and you wiggle your thumb like this. Or if you strongly disagree, put your thumb down and wiggle it. And so now we have a 5-point scale. It could be, could be a strongly agree to strongly disagree. And one that we've used, I've used in some practice sessions before. And you might think to yourself, now, how would you respond to it? But one of the practice groups we sometimes have done has been with people who travel by airplane, about what inconveniences have they had. And one of the inconveniences that often comes up are children who are doing things on the airplane, can be disturbing for some time for the other passengers. And so one of the solutions, and I ask people, we're going to do a thumbs up and thumbs down. It's a 5-point scale, like I had just indicated. And I'm going to give you a situation. I want you to tell me to what extent do you agree or disagree with the solution? And so here's the situation, that children are sometimes do things that cause disturbances for others. And so one proposed solution that the airline had was that if parents come onto a plane with small children, they put all of them into one part of the airplane, way to the front or to the back or in one place. And if this were to be a policy, To what extent would you agree or disagree with this policy? And I count to three, and at the count of three, I want you to hold your thumbs up. One, and I count because I don't want them to jump ahead. I want them to all do it at once without looking at each other. So 1, 2, 3, okay, hold up. What's interesting on that question is how many people are strongly one way or the other. And then what we will do is often have a little conversation about it. Those who felt strongly, tell me more about that. There's some who felt strongly in favor, some who felt strongly against. Typically, the ones you want to hear from are those on the ends. What are their primary concerns? And they can often give you insight. A 5-point scale with fingers. You know, you could have the same strongly agree with 5 to strongly disagree with 1. And so hold up the number of fingers. The a number of times in a focus group, I'll find people who will express a point of view of a concern, there's some passion, and I want to know how strongly they feel about it. And I'll use a 5-point scale. It's sort of like the doctor's pain scale, only that's on a 10-point scale. But okay, on a 5-point scale, how strongly do you feel about that topic? 5 means you feel very strongly. 1, not strongly at all. And so somewhere between 1 and 5, at the count of 3, hold up your hands with the number of fingers on how strongly you feel. And this is oftentimes a way of just quickly looking at your screen, getting a sense, where are people coming? And then again, you have a sense you may want to hear from people on both sides of what comments do they want to add. Now, keep in mind that you may want to do a quick count, but the richness comes when they give you the reasons. They tell you what's happening. And the reason I like to do the little number thing is I find that people use words that tend to be misleading, and that they may talk a lot and they may talk like language that they strongly support it. But when I have them hold up a finger, it's 2 or 3. It isn't like a strong reaction. And so when you quantify it, it can be helpful. And so sometimes I'll do those types of things. There are times where I will also ask people to take a piece of paper and list things. 3 obstacles you have in doing something. What are the 3 advantages of something? And I usually specify a number. The difficulty is that once you get over 3 or 4, it becomes very difficult. I'd rather try to get the top 3 off the top of the mind, or the top 1, but write them down. And then we go around and I ask, and I'll often make a list of those. And then sometimes I'll even have them, if I use the whiteboard, I might put them on a whiteboard and then come back and ask them which of those is the most important. Sometimes I'll have them draw a sketch. I'll create a situation and I'll say, okay, here is, well, let me show you an example. I'm going to zoom ahead here to one of my last slides, and then I'll come back. So be patient with me. I want to show you a sketch. Here's one we used in a focus group with a home health aide that was making a home visit. We asked the mothers, these were with mothers, that when this person came to your home, of this new mother, and this was an ideal home visit, draw a picture of you with the home health aide, and you can have your husband there if you want and the baby, but the home health aide is saying something. And to you, this is the greatest visit. This is a wonderful home health care visit that you're having. What is the healthcare worker saying? Make a little stick figure sketch. And you know what happened in this study? It was fascinating. We had thought that the most important things were going to be some technical knowledge that the home health aide shared with the new mother. You know, how to feed, weigh, take care of the baby. When we had them do this and we looked at the collection of sketches, the home health aide is saying, "You're doing great. Everything is just right." We discovered what the mothers really valued was the affirmation, the confidence. There's so many doubts and worries that they're having about it, that here's an experienced person telling them, "You're okay. This is going to work for you." And it was this emotional message was more important to them than the technical information. Now, we're not saying the technical information was unimportant, but it was important to have this emotional component. We wouldn't have known that. No mother came out and directly said this, but when they drew the pictures, these sketches became very powerful. And so sketches, a flow diagram. How does something work? Make it, write down a series of steps. In a bit, I'll show you a little one of getting a COVID shot. When I first got my COVID shot, I listed, wait, I'm going to jump to that one. Just hold on. I wrote down the steps that I needed to do to get a COVID vaccination. And people were wondering, well, why are people hesitant? Well, when I thought about it, it took me 15 steps to get my first COVID vaccination. And I wondered, now, maybe that's more than what we need. Is there a better way? Along the way, there may be some ways that this could be streamlined. Is this one of the barriers that people have? And it never occurred to me that something as simple as getting a vaccination really was complicated. And we don't know that unless we actually sit and ask people about it. Another type is completing a sentence. You start a sentence. What I like best is fill in the blank. And then a follow-up or a probe. And that's usually a question like, tell me more about, or could you give me an example? But these are the kinds of active involvement of the participants. Capturing of the data. There's several ways you're going to use a number of strategies to capture data, and be thinking about this. Memory is helpful, but it is fallible. It erodes quickly. Especially if you do 2 or 3, you'll begin to lose your memory of your first 1 or 2. And so it's important to have a plan for how you're going to capture it. There is a record feature on Zoom that can be very helpful. When I use that, I also use an external digital audio recorder. I set mine by my computer and record right off the audio on my computer. And I get actually quite good results. And I'm able to then basically download that as an MP3 file, and I can go through it quite quickly. I can send it in to get an artificial transcript, or even send it out and get an actual person to do the transcript if I need to do that. But the audio part is an important part. The video, to me, has been less helpful unless you've got certain kinds of things where the video can capture it. But the audio is usually an easier type of thing, and it should be the very basic minimum. Also taking notes. And this is, as you're going along, you'll be able to take notes, but they won't be comprehensive or complete. You may want to have a colleague sitting with you, kind of off camera, to the side, but listening in, and using a note table with questions with each person's name. And then basically this helper is there not to engage in the conversation, to take notes. Here's an example of a little note-taking scheme that we used recently. Basically, the questions are down on the left side. I haven't listed all of them. And in this case, we had 4 people. and this happened to be a study on soybean pests. And the first question dealt with the biggest concern you have about soybean pests. And what we do is in the notes, we would record each one. And then second question, again, these were abbreviated questions, but these were the things, and we'd use this as we took the notes, trying to capture the actual words they use. There are times where we at least get the concept, but if possible, the actual words that they're using to describe those. But a little way, a strategy of taking notes can be very helpful. And this little sort of a matrix can be a useful kind of an issue. Some special issues with Zoom. One of those, you will have people that are very talkative. This seems to be true of whenever you have people who are known to be experts in a topic. They know something, they're in depth. If you have a Zoom group with professionals, and you're talking about something that they're knowledgeable about, it very likely you'll get a few people they'll have a tendency to dominate the conversation. This presents an interesting challenge to you because sometimes these talkative people saying a lot isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of valuable information comes from talkative people. They just know more, have had more experience. The difficulty lies if they are preventing other people from sharing. And that becomes a concern to you as you're trying to gather the information from the group. If you find you have a very talkative person, well, there's a couple strategies that you can use. One of those is that keep the group small. If you know in advance they're quite knowledgeable, 4 is the maximum I would do, and maybe even 3, because they're going to talk and they want to share information with each other. Keep the group small. I would send them the questions in advance so they know how many questions, and it gives them sort of a sense of where this group is going to go. Some people might think there's only one question and I should talk for a half hour on it. That won't work. And sometimes what you might want to do, and you'll have to think about if you're comfortable and if it works within the group, but I've had moderators who have done this where they will say, now there are times where I know people get excited and they share a lot of information, and it's important that we hear from everyone in the group. And so as we're talking today, and if there are times where we need to move to another person or another topic, I will wave my hand in front of the camera like that. And so if you see me waving and you're doing the talking, I'd like you to wrap it up, finish within a couple sentences, and then we want to move on. And so we give other people the chance. I do that more readily if the person is repeating themselves. Some people are talkative and they're saying the same thing over and over. That doesn't really help you. That's, in a way, wasting time. If they're giving you new information, I give them more latitude. And if they truly are very information rich, I might say to them, Betty, you clearly have had a lot of experience in this. What I'd like to suggest is, could I talk with you individually tomorrow on the phone? And could we set up a time where I just might talk to you because you clearly have a lot of knowledge? And that way we can spend more time on the rest of this group listening to other people. And so we'll quickly set up a time. I'll call you tomorrow, 10 o'clock. We'll have our individual conversation. And so these are probably better handled individually, because if they're that talkative, there is no conversation. Another problem is people not talking. And I usually watch for this in the group. If someone is not talking, I will call on them and say, Bob, we've not heard from you on this question. Do you have anything you want to share? Um, and so be watchful. Some people will just sort of sit and listen. And I would really much rather have them engaged. And they may choose not to say anything. They may choose, well, I'll pass on that, which is fine. But at least I know they've been given a chance. Another issue that can happen is you have a bad or a lost internet connection. It depends on where people are. And if that is a possibility, if you live in an area where this sometimes happens, you may want to address it in your, and what I usually tell people, if for some reason something happens on your computer or your internet connection, um, you might want to try to sign back in, try a couple times, and if it doesn't work, um, then I'll be back in touch with you. I'll pay attention to who is discontinuing, and if you, for some reason, have signed off, I'll be back in touch with you at a later time. Uh, and so you have a little plan for what they do. And so usually trying several times to reconnect is a helpful strategy. I developed a quality control checklist. And these are for both in-person focus groups and for online focus groups. And what I was trying to do is develop a set of questions, sort of a checklist that you might have at the beginning or the end of a study to sort of get confidence about how on target was your study, how good was it? And it's a way of sort of diagnosing what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses. And as I've looked over studies that people have done, these are some of the most important things, and I would offer them to you as sort of a checklist. Now, each of you will have slightly different kinds of situations. Some of you may be using these for academic research. Some of them for you perhaps for a dissertation. Some of you might want to do it and look for a publication. Others of you are just sharing them with an audience. And so one one of the factors to keep in mind is your purpose of why you're doing this. And so the checklist may be modified or changed a bit. But these are sort of the big questions. Are you listening to the right people? Do you have the information people? There are times where people did not give enough thought to, do the people really have the characteristics that we are looking for? Uh, Let me give you a quick example of in my family, when my grandson was an infant and in diapers, his mother was invited to a number of focus groups to talk about diapers and purchasing of diapers. And if any of you are young parents, you might also be a prime recruit for that kind of a study. Now, it's interesting that this happened to be in market research, uh, but they were listening not to people who changed diapers. You know, they didn't invite me. I've changed a few diapers, but I am not the most information rich. You know, and my grandson's father, he knows how. He knows more than I do, but he's not information rich. The one that is the mother in this case, in our family. She would study the labels. She knew exactly what to look for when it comes to purchasing of diapers. And it was interesting that she was the information rich. I would have talked and I would have tried to sound like I knew something about it. Uh, and and this is sort of the interesting things. There are people who have a casual knowledge of something, and they'll be happy to talk, but they don't have sort of what it is to see it from a person who's up close and personal experience. So to think about who are the right people. Back a few years ago, we did a study of teenagers on alcoholic consumption. There was a problem in a county public health department about teenagers drinking and getting into fatal car crashes. and we were doing a study. We wanted to do focus groups with teenagers. And we spent a good portion of the evening with parents and teenagers talking about how to plan the study. Much revolved around who are the teenagers that we want to listen to. Because we started off thinking about just a random sample. No, random samples do not give you insights as to a variety of things of kids who are having drinking issues. And after a fair amount of discussion, there was a parent who actually got up to the chalkboard and said, he drew a line across the chalkboard and said, here's what I think we've got. We've got on one end teens that do not drink. They're kids that have got sort of desirable ways of expressing. They will often be the ones who talk to adults. They're very comfortable sharing insights with adults. When adults listen to teenagers, these are the ones we usually listen to. But frankly, they don't know much about these drinking parties because they don't go. On the other end are the kids who have a persistent chronic problem with drinking. And for them, this is not an issue. They don't think about it because drinking is a major problem. And he said, our heart goes out to them because uh, we're not going to probably change their minds about something. And we're not going to learn a lot because they've already bought into it. But this parent said the ones that are information rich are the ones in the middle, the ones who sometimes will drink, sometimes not. They go to these parties. They sometimes drink and sometimes don't. And that became the screen that we used. The parents asked the question, well, how do we know who they are? And the teens in the group said, we know who they are. And what we'll do is we'll screen. And the question became, have you, in the last 2 months, have you been at a party where alcohol was served to teenagers? We never asked them if they drank. We didn't ask if they participated. We wanted to know if you were there. And those were the ones we invited. They were the information rich because they knew the refusal skills. People would come to them and say, how come you're not? Or, and they were the ones who could give us the insight on this topic. So think about who are the right people that you want to reach, the ones who have the knowledge that you want. Don't skate too quickly over that one. That's an important issue. Do you have a skillful moderator? I've watched hundreds and hundreds of moderators, and there are a number that have just it's almost like a natural gift to do this. I've seen it in older teenagers, I've seen it in adults, I've seen it in seniors, I've seen it in professionals. There are some who are just brilliant at doing it, and there's very little I can teach them about how to do it better. They have a natural gift of conveying sincerity, wanting to hear, holding back on their own opinions and views, getting others to share, and encouraging a conversation. You don't want someone who's there sharing their own experiences. You don't want someone who's passing judgment on whether something was good or not. You want something who will engage people, make them feel comfortable, and get them talkative. So look around and think, it may not be the principal investigator in your study. It may be someone else. And there are times where we've gone into communities where we have different languages and we don't know the language, but we find someone in the community who knows the language, who's lived there and is trusted in the community. And they not only know the language, but they know the culture, they know the practices, and they're respected in the community. And so there are times where we do community-based studies, we will have someone from the community. We'll give them a little training on how to ask the questions. Here are the questions. Here's how how to capture the notes and so forth. But a conversation with people from a community can be very helpful. Do you have multiple means of capturing data? Not just one. Don't bet the farm on just an audio recording. Take notes, use your memory. By the way, with memory, what you do with memory is very valuable. Your initial insights in memory, The 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes at the end of the group is prime time. Take things from your memory, put them down in your notes, talk with your colleagues who have listened in, do what we call a debriefing, where you are taking things from memory, putting them into another form. Do not schedule your group so you go right from one into another. You need time to unload, unpack what you have, put it down into a permanent kind of a form. And so what we recommend is, yes, use memory. You have field notes, you have audio recordings. Once in a while, you may have a video recording as well. All of these help with your means of capturing data. Another factor in quality control is having some time between groups. There are times where people are tempted, both online and in person, to do them back to back. This is especially true if you're doing them in person in a remote city, where you do one in the morning and one or two in the afternoon. People have done this, but listen, your brain can't handle it, your memory can't handle it. Leave a gap if you can. The longer, the better. Well, not completely, but enough time to digest it, to think and reflect about, are they answering the question? By the way, that relates to the next point. One of the things we suggest is that if you're beginning a series of focus groups, by the way, we do these in a series. Rarely do we do a single group. We have done them. They can be helpful. But the strength, the power of a focus group study is a series of focus groups, 3, 4, sometimes more, depending upon the grouping of the people. But we look for a pattern that is cutting across those. And so and sometimes we have to then do it geographically in different ways. There are a number of ways of dividing them up. But the idea is that after the first one, or if it's a series of say 5 or 6, maybe after the second one, take a careful look at what data you have. Take a look at your transcript, read it, look at your field notes, ask yourself the questions. Are you getting the answers, or are the questions not working as effectively as you want? Don't assume that the questions you ask at the very beginning are going to be the ones you want to ask throughout. But increasingly, it's difficult to change questions because you don't have that pattern. So if you're going to change a question, do it very early so that you develop a pattern of how people are answering it. This is where having a little practice group where you actually practice the questions can be very helpful, so you know your questions are going to work for you. One of the things that relates to quality is that you both have and you can demonstrate and you can explain explicit and verifiable systematic analysis. That has a lot of big words in there. But what makes this research, there's several things that make what you've just done respectable research. And one is how you handled the data, how you went from the raw data to the results that you have. And one of the questions that people are going to ask is, how did you do it? What was the process you used? And what we often will do in these cases is explain how we had a set of questions that we knew at the very beginning. We asked these questions in the group. We recorded these questions. We transcribed these questions. We looked at patterns that existed. There are times where we do these on sheets of paper and cut them up. There are times where we do them using a word processor. We'll often try to save examples of the different steps along. And it's interesting that skeptics, and there are people who are still today skeptical of any qualitative research. And oftentimes what they want to know is, how do we know you're not just making this up? Can you trace it back? Is it a systematic process going back to the raw data, the conversation itself? Sometimes we've done things like an audit where we actually do the analysis backwards, tracing everything back to the original comments. Usually that's not necessary, but in some extreme cases it is. But it's important that the researchers, those doing the study, and again, this depends on the audience. If you're doing it for a dissertation, if you're doing it for an audience that is primarily trained in quantitative methods, uh, often they will want to know, how did you get there? How did you get it? You may have to have in your written report and in your oral presentation a description, or show them how you actually did it. And then one of the other things is the involvement of a research team. Yes, you can do this by yourself. There's no question. I've done it. But I'll tell you that having colleagues with you is very helpful. Having several heads look at the questions, think about the analysis, what it means. This can be very valuable because all of us are limited in the words we use and how we express things. Sometimes you're going to be using the actual words the participants used, and then there are times where there is a pattern, there is something that you have to use another word to describe, and you want to be sure that word is the correct word. This is where having multiple members of a research team can be helpful. So, but also keep in mind that research teams, if they get to be too large, get to be unwieldy. Uh, a compact, smaller research team can be very valuable and add to the credibility. So I would offer to you that these things, you may have found some other things to be helpful, but as I look, and as I reviewed entries or what people want to submit for a journal article or for a dissertation, these are some of the kinds of questions that I would be looking at. And what my suggestion to you is that as you think about your studies, upcoming or ones you've done, are these the things that fit for you? Or are there some other things that might be helpful as well? Here's a couple just miscellaneous kinds of slides that I put in. One of those is what we call the three-step process of actively involving participants. I've done this one both in person groups and online groups. And it takes a little more time. If you're going to do this, you have to allow probably about, well, you may be a 15-minute question where it starts with making a list of things. Like one of the ones that I often do if I'm teaching a class is of graduate students is to talk about what are the barriers that graduate students face today. Make a list of 3 things and jot them down on a piece of paper. And so each person quietly writes them down. I do that instead of just announcing what they are. There's usually 1 or 2 that will dominate. I want everyone to think, jot them down first on a piece of paper. I go around the group and I have each person list and some don't list 3, they might list 1 or 2 or 3. Sometimes they'll do a 4th one, but I'll start making this master list. If it's in person, I'll use a flip chart. If it's online, I might use a whiteboard, or I might use just a sheet of paper that I can hold up to the screen. But I'm going to make a comprehensive list that I'm going to show to them at the end. So this list might have 15 different things on it when we're done. If they list the same things, I'll put a little check mark by the side to indicate that it is something said more than once. And then I hold up the list or have them look at the whiteboard or the flip chart, and I say, now, as you when people were giving their list, they would often tell a little reason why something was important to them. It was typically not just this is it, but this because of this one because of this, and so forth. And the third step, I'll say, now you've listened to the other people, you've seen the lists that they have. I want you to, and you have to think about what words you choose. Now that you've heard others talk about, if you were to pick one most important, which one would it be? Um, and and then I go around the room, round robin again, and I'll circle it or mark it. And what I'm looking for is there a pattern? Are they tending to pile up on one or the other? And especially if there is a pattern, then I'll say, let's talk more about that one. That one seems to be like when we were doing, this was a couple years ago, we were doing this one in class with graduate students. And one of those that came up was time with their advisor. Now, just that phrase, I don't know what that meant, whether it was access or the amount of actual time. And so what we did was we talked about that. We spent another 5 minutes or so actually discussing what that means and why that was considered to be the most frequent and one of the most important ones in the group. So that little process, it's a way of engaging them, but giving you information where they not only give you the list, but some details about it. That one has worked well for us. Rating questions have worked well. Drawing a picture and sharing, that has worked well. Making a flow diagram of what are the steps, especially if it is something that people experience, something that you have not done it personally. You may know about it, but they know something more than you do. And so you have them actually write it out one at a time. And so some of these I found to be beneficial. Here's my ideal home visit one that we talked about. When I had people do a conversation about a COVID vaccination, here were some of the items that came up. Here were some questions that I had used in a COVID online vaccination. What we were trying to find out, there were often the way you look right at the middle of the screen of what, so to tell you which are the most important. Sort of like questions 5 and 6. What were the best arguments for getting a COVID vaccination? If you were trying to convince someone to get a vaccination, what would you say or do? But these were sort of the questions we used that we found to be helpful. Well, I'm going to stop sharing. You've seen a number of things. Okay, we're back on track.